My son-in-law thought old age had made me soft. He thought 67 years of living had worn me down to something he could step over. He sat across my dinner table, cutting his steak with a smile I had long since learned to distrust, and I could see it in his eyes, the quiet arithmetic of a man calculating what I was worth and how much longer he would have to wait for it. He didn't know that I could see him. He didn't know that I had been watching men exactly like him since before he was born. And he certainly didn't know that the fog he believed was settling over my mind was the most precise trap I had ever engineered in 40 years of building things meant to last. My name is Walter Graves. I am 67 years old, and I spent the better part of my life as a petroleum engineer in Houston, Texas. I started as a site technician straight out of Prairie View. A&M, worked my way up through a world that wasn't always ready for a black man with a slide rule and a sharper mind than his supervisors, and I retired as a senior project director with a reputation that I had earned with my hands, my back, and my integrity. My wife, God rest her, used to say that I was made of the same material as the deep-water pipelines I designed, built for pressure, built for the long haul, and near impossible to break from the outside. She was right about most things. She was especially right about people. She passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, swift and merciless, the kind that doesn't give you time to say everything you need to say. The house she and I had shared for 31 years went quiet in a way I had never experienced. A silence so heavy it had texture, something you could press your hand against in the dark. My daughter stepped into that silence like light under a door. And for that, I will be grateful for the rest of my breathing days. She called every morning. She drove over every Sunday with food I didn't need but accepted because what I needed was her face. She is everything her mother built her to be: generous, perceptive, and loyal to a fault. That last quality, the loyalty, was the thing her husband had learned to exploit the most. She had married him 2 years before her mother died. He came into our lives with a firm handshake and a catalog of ambitions, the kind of man who talks about his 5-year plan within 20 minutes of meeting you. I watched him the way I used to watch junior engineers on a new site, not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful attention of someone who understands that the difference between a sound structure and a catastrophic failure often lives in the details most people overlook. In those early years, I found nothing definitive. He was polished. He was attentive to my daughter in the ways that were visible. He remembered my birthday and called me sir without being asked. But there were small things. The way his eyes moved around my house the first time he visited, slow and deliberate, like a surveyor taking measurements. The way he steered conversations toward my retirement portfolio with what he clearly believed was casual subtlety. The way he spoke about my age, not with affection but with a kind of impatience, as though my continued good health was an inconvenience to a schedule he hadn't shared with anyone. After my wife passed, those small things grew louder. It started with what he called concern. He began mentioning, in the careful tone of a man planting seeds, that I seemed tired, that I had repeated myself on the phone, that my daughter worried about me living alone in a house this large. These observations were delivered with such practiced tenderness that my daughter received them as love. I received them for what they were: groundwork. He was building a narrative, one careful brick at a time. And the narrative was that Walter Graves was fading. I was not fading. But I decided to let him believe I was. The Sunday that changed everything started the way they all did, with my daughter in the kitchen reheating the gumbo she had brought, and her husband settled into my living room with the particular comfort of a man who has already decided a space belongs to him. I had built that house myself, designed every room, poured its foundation on a lot I had saved for 6 years to buy. The wood on the mantel came from a cypress tree that fell on the property during a storm in 1994. I had milled it myself and finished it with my own hands over 3 weekends, while my daughter, 9 years old at the time, sat on the workbench and asked me questions I did my best to answer honestly. Her husband looked at that mantel the way men look at things they intend to sell. We ate. The gumbo was her mother's recipe, carried forward with the slight modifications of a daughter who had made it her own, and it was the best thing in the world. He ate without commenting on it, which told me everything I needed to know about the interior life of the man my daughter had chosen. We talked about her work. She manages communications for a nonprofit in Midtown, and about the neighborhood, and about a friend of mine from the engineering firm who had just celebrated his 50th wedding anniversary. Then, as naturally as a man turning a page, he said it. "Walt, I've been thinking. With everything going on with the markets, it might make sense to have someone take a look at your investment accounts, just to make sure everything is structured correctly, for the future." He said it to me, but he was watching my daughter. "I know a guy. He's helped a lot of families in our situation. Our situation." I turned the phrase over in my mind like a stone, examining its underside. "I appreciate that," I said, keeping my voice mild, the edges deliberately soft. "I've been meaning to get organized. My wife always handled the paperwork side of things, you know. I get turned around sometimes." My daughter looked at me with a quiet worry she couldn't quite hide. He looked at me with something else entirely. Relief. Carefully costumed as concern. "That's completely normal," he said. "At your age, it's smart to simplify things. Consolidate. Make it easier on everyone. At your age." I nodded slowly, the way I had seen my own father nod when the world tried to diminish him. Not in surrender, but in the private knowledge that the man speaking had already made his decisive mistake. After they left, I sat in my armchair for a long time. The ceiling fan turned above me, and the house was full of the particular quiet that follows a meal shared with people who are not entirely who they present themselves to be. I thought about my wife, about what she would have said. She would have cut through his performance in 30 seconds flat and delivered her verdict with a sweetness that left no room for argument. She had that gift. I had a different one. I picked up the phone and called my oldest friend, a man I had worked alongside for 22 years, a structural engineer named Theodore who had retired to Galveston and spent his days arguing with pelicans and reading everything he could find. Theodore had introduced me to my wife at a company Christmas party in 1987. He was the best man at our wedding. He had held my hand at her funeral. There is no more trustworthy person in my world. I told him what I had observed and what I intended to do about it. He listened without interrupting, which is the rarest and most valuable quality in a human being. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Walt, do you know who his father is?" I told him I knew his son-in-law's last name, the same last name I had seen on a contract once, a long time ago. A contract that had cost Theodore something he had never fully recovered from. Theodore confirmed it in 2 sentences, and the phone felt suddenly heavier in my hand. "Are you sure?" I asked. "I've never forgotten that name," he said. "And I never will." I sat with that information for a long time after we hung up. The ceiling fan kept turning. The house settled around me the way old houses do, exhaling the day. And something that had here felt like the grief of a suspicious father-in-law began to crystallize into something colder and more precise, the recognition that what was happening in my home was not new. It was a pattern. It was a legacy of a particular kind of greed, passed down like a bad gene through a family that had never once been made to account for what it had taken from others. I went to bed that night, but I did not sleep for a long time. I lay in the dark and I made my plan. The first thing I did was call my attorney. Her name is Patricia, and she is the kind of lawyer who operates with a stillness that makes opposing counsel underestimate her until it is too late. I had worked with her on the formation of a family trust 7 years earlier, and she knew every corner of my financial life. I explained the situation with the same dispassion I would have used to describe a load-bearing calculation. Here are the forces in play, here is the risk, here is what I want the outcome to be. She listened, asked 3 precise questions, and then said, "Walter, what you're describing is a man positioning for an undue influence claim or a conservatorship petition. If he can establish a pattern of cognitive decline, real or manufactured, he could argue that your decisions about your estate are compromised. That's the play." "I know," I said. "I want to give him enough rope." She was quiet for just a moment. "Then here is what we do." What she outlined was thorough and airtight. My existing accounts and the trust documents were already beyond his reach, protected by structures we had built years before any of this began. But I had one account, a brokerage account I had opened separately, older, not under the trust that he didn't know was largely symbolic at this point. I had moved the meaningful assets out of it 6 months ago, when the first tremors of his ambition had become impossible to ignore. What remained in it was not nothing, but it was not the treasure he imagined. "Leave that account visible," Patricia said. "Let him see the statements if he asks. Don't correct his assumptions about what's in it. And the access documents? Here is what we'll do," she said. The following week, I put the second part of my plan into motion. I am a man who built his career on precision, and precision requires the right tools. I ordered a small camera system designed to be embedded in a bookshelf. It looked exactly like the spine of a thick reference book, dark gray, unremarkable. The image quality was extraordinary. It operated on the home wireless network, and I could monitor it from my phone in real time or review stored footage later. I had spent 40 years trusting instruments to tell me the truth when human judgment couldn't be relied upon. This was no different. I installed it on the third shelf of the bookcase in my study, between a copy of a structural engineering reference manual I'd owned since graduate school and a Bible that had belonged to my mother. The camera had a clear sightline to my desk, to the filing cabinet beside it, and most importantly to the top drawer of the desk, the drawer where I had, with deliberate and visible carelessness, placed a single manila folder. The folder was labeled, in my own handwriting, "Accounts Passwords Important." I had left it in the drawer slightly untucked, the corner visible when the drawer was open even halfway. It was the kind of detail a man with a fading mind might leave carelessly. It was also exactly the kind of detail a calculating man looking for leverage would not be able to resist. Inside the folder was not what he was looking for. On a Sunday 3 weeks after the dinner that had started all of this, I called my daughter in the morning and mentioned, with a practiced vagueness, that I couldn't find where I had written down the login for my online brokerage account. I laughed at myself a little. I said something about getting old. I said her husband had offered to help me get things organized, and maybe it was time to take him up on that. I could hear the particular quality of her silence, relief, and worry mixed together. The sound of a daughter who loves her father and has been told by her husband that this call was coming. "I'll have him come by this week," she said. "No rush," I told her. "I'll be home Thursday afternoon. He can stop by if he has a moment." He had a moment. He had a great many moments on Thursday afternoon. He arrived at 2 o'clock with the energy of a man who had been thinking about this visit since the phone call. Dressed well, carrying coffee he had bought me from a shop he knew I liked. A gesture of warmth so perfectly calibrated, it would have moved me if I hadn't already seen the blueprints of what he was building. I let him in. I offered him a seat. I talked for a while about Theodore and about a neighborhood association meeting I had attended. I watched his patience. It was good, better than his father's, I suspected, but there were signs. A slight forward lean when I mentioned the brokerage account. A too casual question about whether I had considered simplifying my financial life. I answered every question with the soft, slightly foggy warmth of a man who was grateful for the help and not entirely sure where he had last left his reading glasses. After about 40 minutes, I excused myself to answer a phone call I had arranged with Theodore in advance. I apologized, told my son-in-law to make himself comfortable, and walked to the back of the house. I stood in my bedroom and watched my phone. The camera feed was clear and still for 63 seconds. Then the image shifted as he stood. He moved through the living room and into the hallway. He paused at the door of the study. I watched him turn the handle. He didn't rush. I'll give him that. He moved through the study with a slow, practiced calm, the kind that comes from having thought through a moment many times before finally arriving in it. He looked at the bookshelves. He looked at the framed degrees on the wall. His eyes settled on the desk. He moved to it, stood before the top drawer for just a moment, and then opened it. I watched him find the folder. He lifted it carefully. He opened it, and I watched his expression change, not all at once, but in stages, the way a structure fails. First the small cracks, and then the catastrophic shift. Because what he found inside that folder was not a list of passwords. It was not account numbers or login credentials or any piece of information that would give him leverage over my financial life. What he found was a letter, handwritten on the same heavy paper I used for all correspondence that mattered, addressed to him by name. Beneath the letter was a document he had never seen before. Beneath that was a photograph old, slightly faded, showing two men shaking hands over a contract on a job site. One of them, a younger version of me, and the other, a man whose face he would recognize immediately, because it was nearly identical to his own. He stood there for a long time. I put my phone in my pocket, told Theodore I would call him back, and walked quietly to the doorway of my study. He didn't hear me come in. He was still holding the letter, his back to the door. His shoulders changed from the architecture they'd had when he arrived, still upright, but no longer with the easy confidence of a man conducting a transaction. He had the posture now of someone who has just realized the ground beneath him is not what the map said it was. "That letter," I said, "is addressed to you." He turned slowly. The folder was in his hands, and the look on his face was one I recognized from engineering post-mortems, the precise expression of a man accounting for where the calculation went wrong. I walked to the chair behind my desk and sat down. I did not raise my voice. I did not feel the heat of anger I had felt in the weeks prior. What I felt was the cold, clean clarity I had always felt when a project reached its decisive moment, everything built, everything in place, and now only the truth remaining to be spoken aloud. "Sit down," I said. He sat. "I want to tell you a story," I said, "and I want you to listen to it completely before you say anything. Can you do that?" He nodded. The folder was still in his hands. In 1986, I began. Theodore Baines and I were 30 years old. We had spent 6 years working for one of the large energy firms here in Houston, learning the business from the inside, saving every dollar we could. We had an idea, not a complicated one, just a sound one. There was a small independent oil services company on the Gulf Coast that was undervalued and poorly managed. If it was acquired and reorganized, it would become worth something significant. We spent 2 years running the numbers, building the case, and putting together the capital to make an offer. Theodore's family contributed. My wife's family contributed. We put in everything we had. I paused. He was very still. "We needed a third partner," I continued. "Someone with existing industry relationships who could smooth the acquisition process and bring in 2 additional investors. A colleague introduced us to your father." Something moved through his eyes when I said it. "He was charming," I said. "Energetic. He understood the business, and he spoke convincingly about his connections. We brought him in as a minority partner. We gave him access to our full business plan, our financial models, our investor contacts, everything we had built, and then we waited for the deal to come together." I looked at the photograph he was still holding. 3 months later, I said, "We discovered that your father had approached both of our investors separately and privately. He told them that Theodore and I had withdrawn from the deal due to undisclosed financial problems. He told them that he had identified 2 replacement partners, men from his own network. He completed the acquisition without us. He used our research, our models, our relationships, and our groundwork to build something he then cut us entirely out of. By the time we understood what had happened, the papers were signed and recorded. I let that settle. Theodore had borrowed against his house to fund his share of the capital," I said. "He lost it. He spent 3 years paying back loans on an investment that someone else was profiting from. The company your father acquired was sold 12 years later for $11 million. The room was very quiet. "We filed a civil complaint," I said. "It went nowhere. Your father's attorney was better funded than ours, and the paper trail had been constructed carefully. We couldn't prove intent. We knew what had happened. Everyone who was there knew what had happened. But the law deals in proof, not in what everyone knows. And so your father kept his money and his reputation and his clean hands." I leaned forward slightly. "I did not know he had a son," I said. "I did not know his son had grown up to become a man who would meet my daughter at a fundraiser 8 years ago and eventually marry her. I did not connect the name until recently, when I started paying close attention to the way you look at things that belong to me. And then I made a phone call to Theodore, who has never stopped knowing that name." He set the folder on the desk between us. His face had lost its careful performance entirely. What remained was something raw, not guilt exactly, but a man confronting a version of himself he had not expected to have to see. He started. I'm not finished, I said. And something in my voice stopped him completely. I want to be very precise with you about what I know and what I can prove, I said. I know that you have spent the last year and a half building a case, in front of my daughter and in private conversations I was not supposed to hear. That I am cognitively declining. I know that you have researched the process for pursuing conservatorship in the state of Texas. I know that you believe there is an account in my name containing assets that would be worth controlling. I know that you came into this room today with the intention of finding information that would help you access that account or leverage it against me. I let him sit with all of that. What I can prove, I said, is what that camera has been recording for the past 3 weeks. His eyes found the bookshelf. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he looked back at me, and for the first time since I had known him, he had nothing to say. The footage begins with a Wednesday evening 3 weeks ago, when you came by unannounced while my daughter was at a work event and spent 12 minutes alone in this room, I said. That was the first time. Thursday is not the first time. It is the third. I let that register. My attorney has reviewed the footage. She has prepared a full documentation of what it shows. She is also in possession of a sworn affidavit from a financial advisor you spoke with 8 months ago, a conversation in which you described my cognitive state in terms that were not consistent with any actual assessment, and asked about the process of challenging estate documents on the basis of diminished capacity. He was very pale now. I am not going to call the police today, I said. Not because you deserve my mercy, but because what I want from this conversation is not your arrest. What I want is for you to understand something fully so that you can carry it with you for the rest of your life. I stood up from behind the desk. I walked to the window that looked out onto the backyard, the yard where my wife had grown tomatoes and gardenias, and a fig tree that still bore fruit every August. I stood there for a moment with my back to him, looking at what we had built together over 30 years. What was still standing? Your father took something from Theodore that could not be fully recovered, I said. Not just the money. Theodore is a proud man. He had built that investment on the belief that his work and his judgment had value in the same rooms as everyone else's. That a handshake between professionals meant what it was supposed to mean. Your father taught him that it didn't. That lesson cost Theodore something that no settlement or court judgment could give back. I turned back to face him. You grew up in a house built on what your father took, I said. I don't know if you knew that. I suspect you didn't. I suspect your father was not the confessing kind. But you grew up with the habits of a man who was raised to believe that the resources of other people are available to those clever enough to reach for them. You look at my home, and you see an inventory. You look at my daughter, and you see proximity to what's mine. You look at me, and you see an obstacle with an expiration date. He opened his mouth. I shook my head. My daughter is going to come home tonight, I said. And you are going to have a conversation with her that is long overdue. I am not going to tell her what to do with the information she receives. Because she is a grown woman, and she has her mother's judgment, and she does not need my protection, she needs the truth. But I am going to make sure she has it. I walked back to the desk and sat down. I looked at him with the same steadiness I had tried to carry through everything. The document under the letter, I said, is a copy of Theodore's original financial records from 1986, showing his contribution to the investment capital. It has been notarized. It is part of a historical record that Patricia is preparing in coordination with Theodore's attorney in Galveston. It is not a legal instrument being used against you today. It is a piece of history that your family buried and that I am choosing to unbury, because I have come to believe that buried things do not stay buried. They just wait. He looked at the document. He looked at the photograph, his father's face. Younger. Caught in the moment of what must have seemed like a great victory. My hand in his. Both of us smiling, neither of us knowing yet what that handshake was worth. You are not your father, I said. But you have been making his choices. And if you keep making them, you will end up where he ended up, which is not somewhere I would wish on the man my daughter loves. Even now. He didn't move for a long time. The afternoon light shifted in the room. The old clock on the shelf above the engineering manual ticked through its quiet, patient measure of seconds. When he finally stood up, he did not try to defend himself. He did not ask questions or offer explanations. He straightened his jacket with the mechanical movement of a man operating on reflex. He looked at the folder on my desk and then at me. And whatever he had come into this house believing about who I was, it was gone. He walked out of the study, through the hallway, through the living room, and out the front door. And I heard his car start and pull away from the curb with a slowness that seemed involuntary, like a man learning to drive in a new landscape. I sat in my study for a while after he left. I called Patricia and told her it was done. I called Theodore and told him the same. He didn't say much. He said, "How do you feel, Walt?" And I thought about it honestly and said I felt tired, but not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. He said he understood, and he did. My daughter came that evening. Not at the usual time earlier, which told me he had called her. She came in with the look her mother used to call the storm face. Not crying yet, but close. Carrying something heavy that she hadn't finished sorting into words. I made tea and we sat at the kitchen table. The same table where she had done homework as a child and where her mother had read every morning until the last year she was able to. I told her everything. All of it. What I had observed. What I had confirmed. What the camera had captured. And the story about her father and Theodore and 1986 that she had never known. I told it straight. Without anger. Without editorializing. I laid it down between us like the documents I had assembled, factual and complete, and let her look at it. She was very quiet through most of it. She asked a few questions. She cried at one point and then stopped herself and asked another question. She was her mother's daughter in the way she received difficult truth, not by falling apart but by going still. The way water goes still before it decides which way to move. We sat together for a long time after I finished. The kitchen was full of the smell of tea, and the particular quality of evening light that comes through the west window in October, amber and precise, laying itself across the table in a slow diagonal. I thought of all the evenings I had sat at this table with her mother. I thought of how much I had wanted to protect my daughter from everything that hurt, and how I had slowly learned that what she needed was not protection but honesty, the same gift my wife had always given me, the unadorned truth delivered with love. "What do I do?" she finally asked. Not to me exactly. More to the evening light. "That's yours to answer," I said. "Not mine." She nodded slowly. She wrapped both hands around her mug. She sat with it for a long time. What came after was not swift or clean. Real things rarely are. The weeks that followed held the kind of hard and necessary conversations that leave permanent marks. The kind that change the shape of a life. My daughter moved through those weeks with a steadiness that astonished me and would not have surprised her mother at all. She made her decision. It was her own. By December, she had begun to come to Sunday dinners alone again, the way she had in the years after her mother passed, and somehow the house felt fuller for it. The way a room feels fuller when you remove the furniture that was always slightly wrong for the space. She brought a Dutch oven full of red beans and rice on the first Sunday it was just the two of us. And we sat at the kitchen table and talked until it was dark outside, the way we used to talk when she was in college, and called on Sunday nights, and we would stay on the phone until one of us fell asleep. I told her the rest of the Theodore story that night, the parts I had left out in the earlier telling, the smaller details I hadn't included, because the architecture of truth requires you to know which elements are load-bearing and which are decoration. I told her about the morning in 1989 when Theodore and I drove out to the Gulf Coast and sat on the hood of my car and looked at the facility that should have been partly ours, and how we didn't say much, just watched the equipment move, and then drove home and went back to work, because that was the only honest answer we knew to the question of what to do when the world takes something from you. "Did you ever forgive him?" she asked. "Theodore's anger, I mean. Theodore forgave a long time ago," I said. "Forgiveness is for you, not for the other person. It's just setting down a weight so you can walk further." She was quiet for a moment. Are you setting it down now? She asked. With all of this? I thought about it. The ceiling fan turned above us. The fig tree in the backyard was bare now, waiting for spring. I think I'm setting down something I didn't know I was carrying, I said. Which is the best kind? There is a thing that happens when you build something carefully, with the right materials, with attention to the forces that will work against it a moment when you step back and look at what's standing. And the satisfaction of it is not pride exactly, but more like recognition. The recognition that the work was real, that it held, that it was worth the doing. I am 67 years old. I have built pipelines that run along the floor of the Gulf of Mexico and will outlast everyone I have ever known. I have built a house that has stood through 4 hurricanes and raised 1 extraordinary woman. I built a marriage that lasted 31 years and left me with a grief I expect to carry all the way to the end without complaint, because it was the proof of something that mattered. What I did not expect, at this age, was to discover that the most important structure I would ever build was also the simplest, just the truth, set carefully in the right place, and the patience to wait for it to do its work. Some men believe that age is a diminishment. They look at a man past 60 and see something winding down, something with diminishing returns, a resource in its final drawdown phase. Those men have never met the right 67-year-old. They have never understood that everything an engineer does in the first 40 years of his career is preparation for the precision of the last 20. I am not winding down. I am building something. And when you build things the right way, from the foundation up, with honesty as your load-bearing material, they stand. If this story reached you, wherever you are listening from, I hope you will consider subscribing to this channel. There are more stories to tell, and every one of them belongs to you.